So we'll start with the section A. I mean, it is slightly sort of misleading if you think that the discussion immediately starts, which I will call master-slave dialectic. They call like lordship and bondage, but you know, sort of historically or kind of in the literature, that it is roughly always referred to as master-slave dialectic. So master is the lordship and the bondage is the slave. But it doesn't start there. So when you look at page 113, 115, that's the first time the concepts, the former is lord, the former is master, and the other is the bondsman, the slave, emerge on page 115. So the pages between 111 to 115 is really the preparation for the emergence of master-slave dialectic. So I always ask in the question for your papers, like, before master-slave, how does master-slave emerge, and then what happens? Because the first couple of pages, at least the paragraphs from 178 to 189, is really pre-master-slave dialectic preparation. Now, another difficulty with Hegel is that he says something and you say, oh, I got it. And then he goes back. And he goes back to justify what he said. And then you say, well, we already said this. And then it is not necessarily linear, it is more circular. So when he says self-consciousness exists in and for itself. Now, what is that in and of itself? Usually when we perceive objects, and the previous sections about consciousness regarded the formation of knowledge and perception, when we understand objects, we understand certain properties associated with the object. And our everyday thinking is, when we are visual person, look at objects, we look at certain properties that exist in themselves in the object. This book is green. This notebook is red. That property is a property of the book that belongs to it. Or this thing that I see is a bottle. This is in itself. Something can be what it is in itself. Now, in perception, throughout the perception, Hegel tries to demonstrate actually these properties themselves that we attribute to objects are not just in themselves, but for another, namely for consciousness. So he goes this really complicated process in sense certainty, perception, and understanding to demonstrate that even the properties that we associate with objects do not belong to objects in and of themselves, but in relation to us. Now, at some point, this is really easy to articulate because I gave you all the proper examples of color. Colors do not exist in nature. Colors only make sense in relation to human eye and how we perceive. The world is itself in physical description doesn't have colors. It has certain reflection of light that is interpreted with our mechanisms to be a certain color, right? So that's not in itself, but it is for another. To be a red object is to be both in itself red as we speak, but it is also for me, red for me. Now, for self-consciousness, this is even more obvious. Now, when we say, I am X, I am Y, we immediately attribute certain properties to ourselves, and we think that these properties belong to us inherently in some natural mechanisms without any relation immediately. And Hegel's entire philosophy is to demonstrate that philosophical truth is never immediate. You cannot just recognize and understand truth. You have to mediate it. You have to put it in relation to something else in order to understand its truth. Truth is not simply self-certainty, just to be certain of something X. Oh, this is a bottle, I am sure, right? Now, scientists would say that and say, this is a bottle because bottle means this, etc. And I'm certain about that and ascertain that. But that is not philosophical truth for Hegel. It doesn't explain the reality of human consciousness. Now, when he says self-consciousness exists in and for itself, when and by the fact that it so exists in and of itself for another. Hegel is over. This is what he means. This is it. This is the entire process. To be something in itself is to be for another. Now, self-consciousness has this peculiar property. Do you first of all understand self-consciousness? Oh, okay, that's a good point. You should have said that earlier. So what is self-consciousness? To be, in German, maybe that will have Kai, Selbstbewusstsein, to be knowledge and cognizant of yourself. Now, when I say to you, Nolia, how are you today?
I'm good.
Okay, are you the one who is good, or what is good, or are you the one who is saying that you are good?
Both? Maybe?
Both. And what if, Nolia, you are telling me that you are good when you are not good?
Then I'm not telling you the truth.
Exactly. Now, immediately here in this kind of articulation, you see a kind of self-consciousness at work. Namely, I am conscious of myself, which means I am both the subject and the object of my consciousness. I take myself as what I know. I mean, if you are a psychologist, you should immediately recognize that self-consciousness is really how human beings exist. We are not objects. We have a relation to ourselves, and our entire existence is articulated within that relationship. When I say, I'm very bored today, I am immediately separating myself from something that is bored, yet another thing that claims to be bored. Who is bored? You are bored. Who is saying that? And, you know, and human consciousness has this particular ability also. I don't know whether you notice it. If you say sufficiently that I am bored, you might either continue to be bored and be bored even more, or magically not be bored. And whenever you say something about yourself, you're always putting yourself outside of yourself. That's self-consciousness. Yes, Kate.
I suppose a question I have for you and that I've been grappling with in a couple different readings of Hegel is, where do you think Hegel draws the line between self-awareness and self-consciousness? Because I think he does think that they're fundamentally different things. Or at least, and I guess I'm more asking for your own personal reading of that, or where you think Hegel draws the line.
Which one you said? My personal reading or his reading?
I would say your reading of Hegel, like not what's the common, because I'm familiar with like what the common reading of that is. I mean, do you agree with that? Do you think that he actually differentiates between the two?
I'm not even aware of the common reading of it. What is awareness translate?
I mean, I think most people say that like awarenessness and consciousness are the same thing, or at least in the discussions I've had about Hegel, they're like, there are two things that can't be separated. But when I'm reading Hegel, I see self-awareness as the thing that exists. It does exist within the self, of where it doesn't depend on another individual to be acknowledging or accepting. But self-consciousness is, in a bit of a, probably not perhaps the best explanation of it, but self-consciousness comes from seeing one's awareness through others. So like Nolia gained her self-consciousness through seeing that you acknowledged her and recognized her. And then thus in watching your perception, she comes to be aware of herself, or conscious of herself, but the awareness of self comes before she even talks to you.
Okay, so before we have that confrontation with the other consciousness, and even we come to the process of recognition, we are talking about awareness. Now, I mean, probably the difficulty is like we need to pay attention to what words that he is using, and he used Selbstbewusstsein for consciousness. Awareness in English has this perhaps non-discursive element in our minds. Like, I'm aware of myself. I know I'm moving my hands, but I'm not really explicitly thinking about that. I am aware of it, but not really. It is kind of a perceptual process. It is not a discursive process, if we can sort of make that distinction. Now, for Hegel, that awareness is always already discursive. There is no immediate awareness of yourself or of anything for Hegel. If you concentrate on sense certainty and consciousness, perception, etc., and understanding, not etc., understanding. So I would say self-consciousness is a more discursive understanding of yourself, which for Hegel, any awareness is always already discursive. It is a sort of attempt to be aware of ourselves without articulating it. Like, you sort of think like, oh, I am aware of the fact that I'm shy, even though I might not explicitly think about that and articulate it in language. So that would be more sort of self-consciousness in the English language. I don't think that there's not going to be much for our purposes that will depend on that distinction.
Okay.
So that's
I was gonna say, when I was reading awareness, I was seeing it more as in the context of not being aware of what one is thinking or feeling or doing, but being able to, I know that you say like a lot of it's discursive, but like Nolia can acknowledge that she is not you, and that is how she puts herself in contrast to you. Self-awareness isn't about focusing on specific things, but acknowledging entities in their whole as being separate things.
Got you. Yes. And maybe that awareness is a kind of intuitive feeling for Hegel, which has absolutely no philosophical truth. I think that's really the issue for Hegel, that, pre-discursive for Hegel is really not something that we can meaningfully understand in philosophy. So it is going to be conceptual. So even art, even the kind of intuitive understanding for him is going to be ultimately discursive in its truth.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Daniel, yes. Wow, with one sentence, with just that one sentence so far. So just don't be anxious. We are just discussing one sentence. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of answered it near the end, but I was just like,
your microphone again. You have to come closer and not move. Yeah.
Okay. Like the distinction Kate was just talking about, I think he sort of answered my question in the end. But like, just like for a passage, he makes a distinction between like the individual who is not the rest of their life, might be a person, but they're not a self-consciousness. And I think that's the sense I sort of got from Kate's question, that like person versus like self-consciousness as qua consciousness.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's a kind of distinction of a structure that goes through human understanding and human consciousness, as opposed to one individual who might say like, oh, I don't have that consciousness of myself. And it's like, okay, fine. But if you want to be conscious, this is how it is. This is how it works. So again, the reason that it sounds abstract is that because for Hegel, this actually should be readily understandable for everybody. That makes it ironically more complicated. So this is the structure of our relationship in terms of our consciousness. And it is not universal in the sense that it applies to everybody, but it's conceptual. It has a kind of necessity that we are going to try to unpack. So let's just, this must be happening in every kind of encounter, whether we are aware of this or not. So self-consciousness exists in and for itself. First, in itself, like I look at myself, I have an awareness, let's just say, of myself, right? So I am me, right? But I also exist for another. That for another might be me, in which case I exist for myself and I have desires. I sort of say, now I want this. I want to go and drink a cup of tea. Now, in the future me, that would be the one that has drunk the tea, right? So that is existing for yourself in a way that you exist for the future. you project yourself as an object that needs to be satisfied. You sort of say like, oh, I'm going to feed myself when I'm this, etc. So regardless whether how this manifests itself in other living beings, in human beings, that already suggests a self-relation. And for Hegel, you always exist in that self-relation. That is a form of doubling already, which we are going to come to. So it exists only in being acknowledged. Now, there are two dimensions here. First, you need to acknowledge yourself, of course, but for another means that you need to be acknowledged as such. So, in fact, whenever you express something about yourself, you implicitly seek that acknowledgement. This is an expression. This is the nature of an expression. So whenever you're like, what do you want to say about yourself? Do you want to say anything about yourself? Even to yourself, the kind of understanding of yourself. When you say something, I'm shy. And it's like, you know, that even the possibility of being shy, ironically turns out to be other people acknowledging you as such. And that's the relationality that Hegel is moving towards. And this is what we need to see. In and of itself, being something is mediated, always mediated, really or imaginatively through the other. We are not objects. Our properties are not like the properties of the objects. Even the properties of the objects are not like the properties of the objects that we imagine. But leaving aside the process of consciousness, self-consciousness starts with the acknowledgement that human properties are always relational, never properties in and of itself belonging to an object. You are not shy in the way that this book is green. That's it. That's the main thing. That's all of it. Yes.
Actually, never mind. This moves on to a passage later that I'm sure will come to eventually. I'll ask my question then.
Well, the notion. Oh, bless it.
Oh, I just have a question. You said, like, with the example of being shy, that you're not shy in the same way that like an object is green, like a book is green. But what if, like, because like, okay, wait, I think I understand. Like, if it's relational, what if I'm actually not shy? Like, I'm not shy. Isn't it the same thing as like perception? Like, it's how you're being perceived. Like, isn't it the same thing? Like, you get perceived as being a shy person, and then I am shy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think that I would give the example without getting too much into sort of complex issues. Like whenever somebody says shy, I always see like, you are saying that to me because you are shy in relation to me. I bet nobody is shy in the same way to everybody they encounter in life all the time. Because that really defies the whole meaning of human relationship. I hope you are not shy, at least in the same way to me that you are to your mother and father or sister and brother. So even that property that you attribute to yourself is modified, at least in terms of your relationship to other people. And no human, like, and even the greenness of the object is as such, because it is maybe more intensely green to you, etc. But with human properties, and I always put these properties in quotation marks because we do not have properties. This is the biggest mistake that we make about ourselves. We think that certain things belong to us unchangingly, categorically. This is why we make the mistake of identity, thinking that it is a stable or even capable of being stabilized thing. And science really screws us up in this because they give us these labels in terms of their physical manifestations. And one of the things, obviously, for the context of this class is this issue of race. We always think of race as if it has some kind of a biological basis, which never did, never had, but science tried to convince us that racial identity was something that could be stabilized. Now we realize that it is not the case. I mean, even scientists today recognize that, but though that the relational aspect of it doesn't go away. And that's really the reality, because we always think of reality as like, oh, does it have a physical basis? No, it has a social, intercultural, subjective existence, which is much more relational than substantial, which means it can change, and it does always change, but it also has an impact beyond this physical manifestation. We'll come to that. I don't want to make it too complicated, but I like whenever somebody says I am shy, I say, my daughter says that, I say, you're not shy. You yell at me, scream at me, slap me, do all sorts of things. Like, you are shy to other people, not to me. So that's sort of a complexity of the property that you cannot be, green like a book. Even a book is not green to everybody, but that's a different discussion. Yes, Daniel.
So yeah, just to clarify, that means that would mean like consciousness is not a property.
Yes, no, of course, not
yeah.
a property. It's a relationship. It is a relationship. Now, when you say I have a self relationship, you make this mistake of thinking like I'm an object and I'm a subject. No, there's no object, there's no subject, there's only relationship. It's a movement. It's a movement itself. And then you think, you are conscious, etc., and then it disappears. You're gone. You die. I don't know what happens afterward. Okay, are we good? Okay, I'm putting your hands down just because I can, but also like helps me to orient myself when somebody else raises their hands. Okay, the notion is the concept. Now, for Hegel, the truth of something, especially something like self-consciousness and consequently identity, is a movement that needs to find itself in its full manifestation. It cannot be what it is just immediately. This is a very important notion for Hegel. Immediacy is what we seek because of a certain prejudice with respect to the world. We want to be immediately certain about something. This is the scientific worldview. We need to judge. We need to immediately know. For Hegel, philosophical truth is never immediately present. You need to go through the concept, articulate it, understand it, unfold it in order to reach its truth. So truth is never just some factual truth like Caesar was born in 300 and blah, blah. That is historical truth, not a conceptual truth, which needs to be developed and thought through in order to be understood. So whenever you ask a question, Hegel is asking a philosophical question. When you say, what is the meaning of the term blah, blah, then you can give it from a sort of dictionary and try to find a meaning, but also you try to understand how that meaning developed over different manifestations. And that understanding is a philosophical unfolding of its truth rather than this immediate quick answer. So the notion is therefore translates the term Begriff, which usually is translated as concept, which literally in German means grasping. So philosophical truth is like grasping the truth rather than having immediately present to itself. So you need to think in order to articulate. So therefore philosophers, when they ask these annoying questions, they are invitations to think and to develop the idea, not just immediately stay with the first and easiest answer. Okay, maybe I'll read one more sentence. The notion of this, it's unity in its duplication. Unity in duplication. And that's a really crucial idea for Hegel too. The idea of unity, to be self-same, is never an immediate process. It is always a mediation and relation with the other. You can be what you are because of the other. You can have a self-relationship to yourself only because of the other. You cannot be immediately what you are except in a relationship to the other. This is very crucial to understand the unity of opposite. I'm sure when you watch YouTube, a lot of people talk about Hegel and dialectic and say about the unity of opposite. It sounds very abstract when you say it like that. You really need to articulate the unity of self-consciousness necessarily being in relation to the other. A duplication. And it has embraces many varied meanings. And that's like you have a self relationship to yourself, and in the meantime, you are also having a relationship to the other, and then the other is having a relationship to itself, but it's also having a relationship to itself through you. This is the various meanings. So when two people encounter each other, a lot of things are happening. We just sort of say, hey, what's up? I'm good. How are you? Blah, blah. But what transpires in the confrontation of two self-consciousnesses, a lot of complex structures at work. And you all know this. It's just that you never explicitly articulated this. You went through life, most of you, I guess, me too, sort of like encountering with other people, meaningful or meaningless encounters, without really thinking about the presuppositions of that encounter. Therefore, we think of our relationships in a very simple way. We judge it immediately, but you don't see the multiple varied meanings that exist within that encounter. And Hegel is inviting you to think that. He is inviting us to try to articulate things that you already know, but you do not explicitly say. So whenever you shake somebody's hand, if you can, you shouldn't during pandemic, but if you shake somebody's hand, there's a whole set of complex relationships happening. And the Hegel's insight is that you already know this. This is nothing new. I'm not inventing some new science or quantum mechanics or something like that. I'm just simply articulating the presuppositions of what you are already doing. Even now, when we are talking to each other, we are trying to understand, like maybe we don't feel anxious about it the way in which maybe Hegel is describing, etc. But there's a lot of complex presuppositions happening when two human beings, or in this case, 16, 17, encounter. But you know that, right? I mean, you would admit that. Now, since most of our relationships are purely formalized, since we know in advance what we should or should not say, we go through life without really thinking about this, right? So, I mean, I go to the coffee shop and the person there is a pure function for me. It's a formalized relationship. I give my card, they say thank you, I say I thank you, I move on with my life. But even there, if you think about it, if you have the time, take the time and reflect upon that structure, I'm coming there as within this sort of structure of like self-consciousness, and they are relating to me in that sense. So what Hegel is trying to do is to get to the bottom of this, like what must be happening in this encounter. Okay, does that help a little? I mean, it doesn't help to explain the text yet, but at least to sort of delimit what we are trying to understand. Okay.
Do you think we could take a really quick break?
Not quick.
Not quick.
I'm tired.
How
So
long break?
let's just say 8.5 minutes.
Okay.
All right.
All of
So one thing also that makes Hegel's writing complicated to understand is the kind of, he says what he's going to do, and when he does it, you forget that he actually said what he was going to do, and then you have to come back to that moment. So he says, it's moments. So we are speaking about a process. He is describing different moments of the same process. Its moments then must, on the one hand, be held strictly apart. Like, this is self-consciousness, this is self-consciousness, this is different, this is different. So they need to be held apart. And on the other hand, must in this differentiation at the same time also be taken and known as not distinct, or in their opposite significance. Then you go like, okay, so I am this because that one is that. So now you are thinking those moments in relation to each other rather than apart. So it gets complicated because he's describing this process of going through different moments. And at any given point, you have to always orient yourself with Hegel, like, where am I now? What are we talking about now? Yeah, we finished that discussion, and then we go back to the previous moment of that discussion, and you go like, why did we get here? We had already been through this. Why are you saying this again? So we are going to do at least try to represent Hegel as linearly as possible so that we have a grasp of the logic, even though we might not understand each single part of the text. So the detailed exposition of the notion, concept of this spiritual unity in its duplication. You need to pay attention to this word duplication and also ambiguity. These are all German words, doppel. So it is double. Nothing is ambiguous, it's just double. We'll come to that. So duplication will present us with the process of recognition. Now, recognition in English, actually cognition, re always means again, to meet again, to know again. Anerkennung in German means literally getting to know something. Now, with recognition, we already in English suggest like a kind of power relationship. You recognize somebody. Everybody needs to be recognized. Everybody needs other people to be recognized. And even in the concept of power, you immediately understand this notion, namely, for me to have power over you, I need to rely on you recognizing that I have power over you. So power makes me more superior in that sense, I guess, structurally, but also dependent, because if you all say, okay, we are leaving now, turn off the Zoom and leaving class, I have absolutely no recognition. So that's the doubleness of this. When you are sort of being recognized, you seem superior and you are recognized, but you also are dependent on the one who recognizes you. And this is going to be a really important aspect of understanding for us in general human power relationships, but also specifically understanding the nature of colonialism in terms of recognition. But it's going to be a different issue in terms of material condition. So Daniel, you had a question.
Yeah, it's just like this passage about like the various moments and stuff. Does that correspond to the like in sense certainty when he talks about the insofar as and the also? Is that same thread still being expressed here?
Well, not everybody read this uncertainty, but I can tell you very briefly, like, yeah, that is in actually maybe in perception, but here it's like now, this moment, and here, and I. Those are two separate moments in sense certainty, but you need to think of their unity. So once he talks about the I exclusively, and then he talks about the here, and then he talks about them together, and then goes back to talk about I, it's a previous moment, it's a separate moment, held separately, but we already established that it cannot exist on its own except in relation to the now. Right? So a certain level of difficulty is that even if we acknowledge that, you know, when you say I'm shy, you are always already talking about a relationship to someone else, you still keep saying I'm shy, and you keep thinking that there might be a property about me. I mean, this class will end in 2 hours. You'll still go back and continue to think about yourself as an object with properties. And you'll still think that I'm shy, and then you'll say shy. And then when I catch you to say that, remember we talked about Hegel, you are not really shy in and of itself, only but for another. So, and in fact, this is the paradox of being shy. Like if you constantly keep saying like, I'm shy, well, you're not, because you can at least say it. You can even articulate it, and you can be self-conscious about it and maybe overcome it in the process. So that's why those are two separate moments, but in relation to each other. So recognition, therefore, anerkennung becomes the claim for Hegel that you are what you are as an identity, as a human being, in terms of its philosophical truth, only in being recognized. Categories of identity, this is for the purposes of our class, categories of identity are never categories in and of themselves. They are always relations. If you don't remember anything from this Hegelian lecture, just remember the fact that you are always potentially talking about yourself in a slightly problematic way. That's more effective, more like whatever. Now, self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. So now remember, when we say about self-consciousness, we are already talking about a double. Me and myself. There was a movie like that, me, myself, whatever. So it's a me, myself, like in consciousness, there's always that notion of being conscious about the self being conscious about itself, self looping back, doubling onto itself. Right? We are clear about that. So now there's another self-consciousness, right? Self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has to come out of itself. So here Hegel relies on that idea that for human beings, for self-consciousnesses to be what they are, they need to be acknowledged by other self-consciousnesses. Namely, when you say I'm shy, you are implicitly expecting the other person, even though they will never say it, they'll say, yes, you are shy. That recognition, you are demanding it, because if you were just like a green book shy, then you would never even articulate that. And Hegel says you wouldn't even be that, because you are not shy in the same way that the object is green. You need that recognition. You need that other to approve that. And that is the process that we go through. So what happens? Self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. Now consciousness wants to know, what am I? Who am I? And I want to be certain of myself. I can understand what I am only in relation to the other. Hence, I need to look. Am I like that? No. Am I like that? Yes. Am I like that in this respect? Yes. I'm not like that in that respect. So you always have this inescapable comparison without which you cannot even recognize anything about yourself. So you come out of itself, a kind of negation. First of all, you say, I'm certain that, oh, there is another. There is not just me. There is another. The first, let's just awareness, going with Kate's language. So you are aware of the other. This has a twofold significance. First, and that's why Hegel gets a little bit confusing. First, it has lost itself. When you got out of yourself, you lost itself. For it finds itself as an other being, finds itself as another being. So now you sort of like, I am not that. When you say I am not that, you recognize yourself in that notness. Like, I am not that. I am separate from that. My identity is being the other of the other. Now, Is that person like, first of all, when you recognize that you are shy? First, when you recognize that somebody who is like extremely comfortable in public spaces, then you realize, oh, I guess I'm shy because I'm not that. So far, I've never really thought about this, but then this jerk can really, behave in public very gracefully. Hence, I must be shy, right? That's the idea. Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, to replace itself. Now, I am seeking for myself in the other. When I look at the other, I'm trying to figure out who I am. So it's not about the other, but about myself. In that comparison, I'm trying to understand myself. Superseded is this complicated German word Aufheben. For Hegel, it's sublation. Sublation means two things. First, negating, I am not that, but it is also including. So this is a very fundamental operation, and I'm going to argue that this is a very fundamental operation of colonialism. Namely, you don't just simply exclude, replace the other, but you can incorporate that truth about the other in relation to you into yourself. So Aufheben means both cancellation and lifting. Aufheben, sort of lift, auf means up. So that supersession is actually a much more complicated process in which you only need to think about when you are encountering another person. What am I doing here? Their non-shyness is actually incorporated into my being the other of myself in which I recognize myself. Now that sounded a little complicated, but if you think about any encounter that you have, any encounter you had in high school, that's pretty obvious, like how you constructed that self-relation to yourself. It's always about the self-relation of the other to itself. I'm going to come to you, Daniel, in 1 second. For it does not see the other as an essential being. So for me, it's always my self-certainty that is at stake. How do I know what I am? But in others sees its own self. So when you say, oh, I'm just like that person, but I'm not that person. I am like that person in being in this regard, but I'm actually different in that regard. So you are always prioritizing yourself as the essential being, but because all consciousness does in terms of knowledge is to be certain of itself. I want to be self-certain. Certainty is what I'm looking for. I need to understand who I am. I need to know who I am. I need to find out who I am. I need to ground myself. That's the nature of consciousness. That self-relation always privileges itself over the other in the first instance. Okay, 2 paragraphs down. Yes, Daniel and Blessed.
Yeah, it was just like it's like a smallish technical thing, I guess. But like in the pink card translation, actually, there's this like he makes a note on the footnote in terms of it has come outside itself, and he uses like it has come to be anxious about itself is like what he notes in the footnote of that, and that sort of, I guess, stuck with me versus like the just coming outside of itself or finding like self-conscious outside itself. Like it seems to suggest something, I don't know, regarding self-conscious is like, yeah, sort of like anxiety about.
Yeah, I'm listening to you. I'm just going to grab the German text.
The German, yeah. Yeah, just sort of like like self-consciousness comes to be anxious about itself. I think like that seems like slightly, I guess, significant than just like it has come outside of itself.
Well, that's a good point. Actually, I'm surprised that they put that. I read that footnote, but I haven't read until the end about the anxiety. I don't know whether anxiety is being outside of yourself, but there is a certain element of madness in Hegel in this relationship of consciousness to itself, which you can actually read. Some people wrote about madness in philosophy and Hegel. So that would be an interesting comparison. I don't know what it will change for our purposes in a significant way, but to coming out of yourself, I want to understand in the first instance as a negation. So like when you recognize another person, there is always that coming out of yourself in the recognition that this person is not me. Therefore, I'm coming out of myself. Now I cannot be who I am by myself, which I could never be actually, but I need to find that out in the other. And we say that, and it sounds like a really nice sort of wise statement, etc. But if you really think about it, it's pretty obvious. Like you find who you are always in the other. And you sort of like always, not in the literal other, and some others more than others, I suppose, but in that comparison, like, you know, oh, like, I mean, again, like you went to high school in the United States or some other place, like there's always that kind of identity formation in relation to the other. Does that make sense? Okay, good. I mean, give me some indication as the other so that I can be certain about myself. Blessed. And then we end, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, so like Hegel's just like pointing out like what happens, like you're saying, like if you really think about it, it seems to be obvious as that's just how you become like self-conscious, I guess it's like the process. But then I want to ask if it's like, is Hegel saying this process is like problematic, or does it like put us at like a disadvantage somehow, or is there a better way of like, is he just like pointing out like this is what happens and not necessarily leaning towards whether or not it's like an acceptable, well, I guess a philosophical way of like becoming self-conscious, I guess.
Good question. I think that he is, for him, describing the structure of consciousness of knowing yourself. In the first instance, Bewusstsein, Wissen, really means knowledge. Like if you think about it like awareness, and in terms of self-knowledge, how do you know yourself in the first instance? How do you become aware? And how do you develop, structurally speaking, what is the presuppositions of being a human? I mean, you are a psychologist as far as I remember. So like, this is the structure of psyche. We cannot treat psyche as an object. We cannot just treat it as something that we can fit external stimulation or drugs, etc. We are talking about the relationship. It's not an object. So we really need to understand that. And sometimes this is what you encounter. You try to interrupt always into the person's relationship to itself, because that person constructs itself in relation to itself, and that's what we call psyche. So whatever we sort of say like, oh, this has this psychological condition, we are actually talking about not the greenness of the book, but we are talking about the relationship that the subject has to itself. That's why you should study philosophy and not psychology. Okay, we are.
So with the sentence, it has come out of itself. I understand your, like, the way you were explaining it as like find myself in other people, but I also understand it as like kind of like seeing myself, coming out of myself to see myself. So is it like both ways? Are both correct?
Yes, very good point. Namely, you are obviously, I don't know whether you went to high school in the United States, whether that makes any difference, etc. But you always see, try, or imagine yourself seeing yourself through the eyes of the other. Absolutely.
Okay.
And you never do, by the way. I mean, that's a sort of fundamental misrecognition, and that's why you need psychoanalysis to make this even more complicated. Namely, your the image that you think that you have in the minds of other people is never the image that you actually, those people have in their minds. You know that, right? I mean, we torture ourselves infinitely because of this, because we sometimes think that we can somehow control the image that we have of ourselves in the minds of other people. That's really the sort of root of most of our psychological sort of problems, in the sense that we seem to have a sense of controlling people's image of ourselves because we project ourselves as the other and form an image of ourselves from the perspective of the other. And if you talk to people over the years and then can get into, then you realize like, what the hell was I thinking? This has absolutely nothing to do what I think, what they thought about me. And I really tortured myself about this for years. And that's really the kind of point that you were making, Leon. Yes, but in the whole process, you are trying to understand yourself. Now, a lot of philosophers reading this obviously try to articulate the significance of the other. The whole philosophy of alterity in the 20th century, starting with Levinas and Derrida, etc., is a response to this dialectical process. So it must supersede. Supersede, again, means replace, aufheben, sublate, which is like sublate, which is a difficult expression, again, which means you have to overcome that otherness of itself. So you always try to come back from this otherness. You always try to be one with yourself. You're always trying to be self-certain. This is the superstition of the first ambiguity. Now, ambiguity is a terrible translation, and it is also a terrible translation in this translation too, because they translated this as ambiguity. So for those of you who know German, Doppelsinn means doppel, double. Sinn can mean meaning, but it also can mean direction. So Doppelsinn is really not, I mean, how would you try double? They actually translate it like that in the other translation. They translate it as double-edged sense, which is kind of awkward, but ambiguity, and you know the expression ambidextrous, like you can use both of your words. Ambi actually in Latin really means double. So when you saw ambiguity, you sometimes think like, oh, it's not clear. No, it's very clear. It's just that it's ambiguous because it has double meaning. So you overcome that double meaning. So this is not like, oh, I'm confused. This is so ambiguous or confusing or abstract, etc. No, it's just as that doubleness inscribed into it. So that is Hegel's conviction that unity is always a function of difference, or without difference, you cannot make sense of the concept of unity. Now, once you come back to that, that is the second doubleness. So now you're like, you went out of yourself, you negated yourself, that's two. And then from that two, you came back to yourself again as self-consciousness mediated through the other. That's the second doubleness. So the first doubleness is that you have with yourself, and the second doubleness is the one that you have with the other. That's as simple as that. So first, I compare myself to myself, self-consciousness, I don't really know much, etc. And then I compare myself to the other, and again, come back from the other with the intention of understanding myself. And you experience that. You sort of think like, I don't know, you think you are shy in the first instance, and then you see a person, then all of a sudden you realize like you are not shy at all. In fact, you are trying to make that person feel comfortable. Then you realize like, okay, I'm shy, but like myself, that ambiguity that I had with myself is now multiplied or doubled. This is a double ambiguity because even though I'm shy, I don't think that I'm as shy as that shy. Or maybe in that sense, I'm not shy. This is an ambiguous situation. Am I shy now? And he says both. Yes, you can be fine. This is the nature of human interaction. This is the nature of the interaction of consciousnesses. They are never simple like green 5 degrees or blue 6 degrees. It's always this relationship. Yes, blessed.
So to me, it's seeming like Hegel suggesting that we shouldn't ever try and define ourselves in a particular way. Like I shouldn't be telling myself that I'm like shy or try and because then you can never really achieve that depending on the people that you're around, because then I might be like, I'm shy, and then I go into a situation like you're saying where someone else is, I'm trying to make them comfortable and talk to them, and then all of a sudden now I'm feeling like maybe I'm confident. So is Hegel suggesting that it's like you're saying, the properties are not stable, that they're always changing, and should we always go through these processes? Should we continuously reevaluate them? Or
but he's not saying what you should or should not do. What he is doing is describing, this is phenomenology, this is a description of what is actually happening. So he is not telling you be shy, don't be shy, etc., or anything like that. It's just whenever human interactions happen at that level of self-consciousness, this is the structure. These are the presuppositions. These are the necessary dimensions of that. Now you can but it is not just it's always changing. More importantly, it is always relational. We tend to think, and consciousness tends to think, actually, self-consciousness tends to think that I am one with myself, self-standing. This is the beginning of this section, independence. Independence actually translates the German term Selbstständigkeit, which means standing on your own. The fantasy of self-consciousness is always to stand on its own and wants to be one with itself as a sort of isolated, independent subject. This is really important to understand. And Hegel shows that even though we think that, we don't understand the truth of this. The truth of this is actually our dependence on the other. Therefore, Selbstständigkeit, what we are seeking, is not something that we can achieve on our own. It's actually something that we achieve in relation to the other. That's going to be really complicated because we live in a culture which, Western culture actually, sort of thinks that you either decide to be an independent human subject or you live in a different culture which has family ties and therefore don't have that much dependence. That is a wrong opposition. That is not even a viable conceptual distinction, because Selbstständigkeit itself, that self-certainty, desire to be on your own, is always at the expense of the other. That's what he's going to try to displace in our conception. It's this is the sort of how we think. We were talking with Kevin about this the other day. I'm here sitting in my office by myself. I am innocent. I'm not responsible for anything. I'm not exercising any power over anybody. I'm just myself. That is the delusion of not seeing multiple relationships through the other that constitutes that independence. And I would argue that's why the United States culture doesn't ever understand racism anyway, but that's a different discussion. Okay, Isao and then Claudia.
Yeah, so you talked about there's a doubleness in our self-consciousness as well as the relationship with others. So I was wondering which of them precede other. I thought the doubleness with the others precede, so that I can recognize my self-consciousness in relationship with others, so that there is, so yeah, like my interpretation was that like my self-consciousness emerges from the relationship with others.
Well, I think Hegel starts with the presupposition that you have that first relationship of self-consciousness to itself. Not because it is true, but in fact, it will prove to be not. And this is the beautiful part of Hegel's philosophy. You start with this in order to show what is the presupposition of that. So consciousness inevitably, I mean, you all do, right? You are in your little corners, in your little squares, and then you think that that relationship is prior. That's how consciousness functions in the first place. Like, okay, my relationship to myself is prior to my relationship to the other. And then Hegel unfolds that, unpacks that slowly, and then shows that, well, actually, your relationship to the other precedes your relationship to yourself, because conceptually, in the first place, you relate to yourself as the other.
Right.
And the recognition of yourself as selbstständig, as independent and standing on your own, is actually a function of the other that gives you that unity, that provides that unity. You can never have unity immediately. It always has to be mediated, which means mediation is relations in relation to the other. Immediacy always means no relation, abstract. I am who I am. That's like God says that, like I am. God doesn't need the other to be what it is, not for human beings. That doesn't even make sense for human beings. So immediate means relationless in itself. Mediation always in relation to something. You are always something, not in yourself, but always in relation to the other.
Okay, so it's the independence, like being independent is immediate, right?
Being initially, and then Hegel will actually articulate, if you are selbstständig, if you are independent, that's the function of the other.
Right.
Not as you first thought that it is the function of yourself.
Okay.
So you are not an object. You remember that. That will be helpful. So this sounds all very difficult, but in fact, it is really talking about something that you always already know. Okay, Claudia.
So my question was kind of similar. It's just like trying to understand as like, yes, our identity might be built like, or like in relation to others, but then that self-conscious of like acknowledging that even your identity or like your properties, would you say, of like of yourself have been also determined by others. Like, is there a way to maybe break from that, or just like through that same consciousness be able to liberate yourself from like that system?
Okay.
I don't let me see where I can go with that. As like understanding that yes, you will probably be determined, like you are kind of determined by others and not yourself, but then you also don't know yourself kind of thing, situation. So it's like also that like the ambiguity between even you knowing yourself and others determining like maybe your characteristics. Like, is there a space there to be able to break from that, from you being able to determine yourself and not by others?
Sure. Okay. Let me ask you a couple of questions. First of all, why do you want that? I'm just curious. Why do you want to separate yourself from the other?
I feel is like more as a doubt, as like we have been told all our, like most of our life, like you're free to be whatever you want, like you can do whatever you want if you put like yourself to,
That's
or
the
like
point, yeah.
but then also like, can you really be whatever you are? Because like even depending on the body that you're born into, like you are determined by a lot of other social factors, and that including that you're like how you said, like, but you are like also like you are who you are probably because you have been determined
Yeah.
to be that. Like for example, the what you were saying about like people calling you shy, I feel that is like when you're called something that you're shy, you will eventually believe that you're shy, and you will eventually engage with what shy means, with like what being shy means, even if you're actually not even shy, you just have been socialized to thinking that. And that's like kind of where I was going for, as like being able to accept that self-conscious and like what people determine for you, but then fighting that as like maybe taking ownership of like
Yeah.
of trying to like negate that you are shy in this case and actually be something else. I don't know if
Well,
I can
that's
explain that.
that you explained very well. That's an excellent question. I love the fact that you are thinking through this, and that's great. So, couple of things. First, what you said about sort of this breaking free from this, that we have this desire to determine ourselves without being determined. I personally, as a father, I consider that as a kind of conceptual abuse to tell your children that they can be whatever they are, because whenever they fail, then they are going to think it's their fault that they couldn't achieve what they were supposed to achieve. So I think that's a myth. That's a sort of like self-deception that we articulate onto ourselves. But here, if you want to determine yourself positively, then yes, you need to kill the other. Because for you to be stable in your own identity, the other has to be stable in their identity as well. And that's what happens between colonizer and the colonized. You always freeze the slave into permanence, because you not only want to articulate and justify your superiority, but you also want to solidify your identity as what it is constantly. And for that, you really need to kill the other. In fact, that's the definition, in a sense, of killing the other beyond material definition. Namely, you cannot be different. You are what you are, and I am what I am, I determine. Now, if you want to know yourself and determine yourself, I think this is really the sort of existential dimension of this class. You are nothing, nothing. Like there is really no determination that you can appropriate from the other and exclude the other from that. So philosophy has this dictum saying like, know thyself. There is nothing to know. There is no thing to know in yourself. And that's the philosophical practice, to be nothing. Because any determination is in relation to the other. If you really want to know yourself, you either have to kill yourself, kill the other permanently, but also this recognition that I don't need to be what I am in terms of categories. I don't need to recognize myself in terms of these oppositional categories. That's the point. So when you want to take one of those determinations onto yourself, then yes, you do have to kill the other. And that's what people do actually, when they ascertain their power on themselves in terms of self-determination. That's only possible on the basis of annihilating the other, because you don't allow yourself to be challenged, sort of questioned, and somehow exposed to this ambiguity at all.
Yeah, because I kind of saw it like in the realm of like social constructs of like, even though you try to break from that, even like there's a certain extent of you being able to break from social constructs, like you're still stuck in the system that other people
Yeah.
are like stuck to these social constructs, even though you try. Like that's like how I was trying to analyze it, and like that kind of makes much more sense now. So thank you.
And Fanon, for example, I don't know whether we'll find time to read Frantz Fanon, but like Fanon is going to say like the true decolonization really requires that kind of death of the other, namely the colonizer, and that doesn't make you free, that doesn't make you decolonize, but that's a process that you need to go through. But in terms of determination, you are absolutely right. And even, I mean, I guess like we live in a sort of post-industrial, post-information capitalist, neoliberal capitalist society, in which that myth of telling yourself, oh, you can be whatever you are, you can construct yourself, etc. And if you don't, you are a failure, you are terrible, etc. is sort of this inability to recognize yourself in terms of constructed and not finding that sort of diminishing or demeaning, but recognizing your reality, because we have a facticity. We are born in a body, in a certain place, with certain people, and to sort of, rather than understanding and acknowledging and recognizing this, we are constantly trying to empower them. Like, I can transcend, then I can become like whatever, and then we glorify these individuals who become like that. But 99.9% of us live under these structures. And we need to recognize that that is given to us. This is the sort of capitalist individualism translated into the conceptual language of identity formation. And we'll read about this. I mean, this will be the sort of question of the post-coloniality, how we also colonize our own selves. Good, good, I like this. 3 sections of Hegel, and look where we are. Okay, Nolia and then Esther. And okay, let me take a moment here to check on other people who are there, but not maybe as comfortable in talking. Do you want to complain a little bit or say what you are thinking? Because like people appear in the left-hand corner of my screen but when they raise their hands, but other people, how are you doing? Hannah, how are you doing?
I'm good. I keep thinking about Julia Kristeva. Do you know her?
Yes.
Okay, I keep thinking about her split subject in terms of like a timeline, like when these like double consciousnesses and self-consciousness, like when these relationships happen, and like, I don't know if you're familiar with like the thetic phase, like when the subject like enters the world of language. Like, I don't really know like how to put the pieces together, but like I'm trying to like build a timeline with this like concept of like a split subject from like a linguistic approach, kind of like how it might affect these relationships and how that helps construct like identities when they're in this like constant phase of like exchanging influence. So
come back to that question after Derrida especially, and Julia Kristeva obviously is a reader of Hegel and Derrida as well. And yeah, I was teaching French feminism maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and then Women's Time, I don't know whether you know that essay, that can actually be Woman's Time by Kristeva, can be a useful way to think about this connection. Yes, Kristeva, right? Yes, okay. Good, well, I didn't know you were thinking of that. Anybody else is thinking something like that and not sharing? Okay, I'll come back to that. Nolia and Esther are getting impatient. Okay, Nolia, go ahead.
Just a small thing that I think is interesting to add on to, like when you and Claudia were talking, I was thinking about how like, even though, so you are being defined and created by others, but you are also defining and creating those others at the same time. And then like when there's that like back and forth and kind of mirroring, it just all, I feel like becomes such a fabrication. And I hadn't thought much about like how like we're talking about the self, like the one person, rather than that person also interacting with those that are creating them, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
And so that it's not as much of a question, just something I wanted to bring up.
It's interesting, like you use the term fabrication in terms of fabric, right? So the fabrication usually means in English, as far as I know, is making it up, which is you just fabricated something, but you meant like interstitials of various kind of forces defining the position of the self. Yes. Now, of course, this is phenomenology, like this is the beginning of self-consciousness. You are absolutely right. When you come to much more complex intersubjective structures, like colonialism, like state, like society, etc., these relationships are going to intersect with each other, and fabric is a really good way of articulating that, because this is in multiple relations. So you are never just face to face with someone in, like, there's always other intermediary structures, other ghosts, other people that are present in that. You know, you remember your past experiences in similar situations and vice versa. So it becomes much more complicated. So, I mean, if anything, like what he teaches is like what appears to be straightforward and ordinary turns out to be incredibly complicated and extraordinary. And I think that's really something you should always think about philosophy, namely, like, complicated things are not something to shy from, is not sort of avoid, etc. It actually extraordinary. It sort of manifests the complexity, and to see that something that appears to be ordinary is really fascinating. And it's like you feel alive, because otherwise everything is so dull and so like ordinary and banal. And whatever appears to be ordinary and banal, if you think about it, it becomes this very lively excitement. Some call it blessed astonishment. Thanks, Nadia. Okay, Esther.
This is backtracking just a little bit when we were talking about seeking the death of the other. The passage that really stuck out to me the most in the reading, is, what's the number? 187, which talks about the staking of one's own life, and then the life and death struggle between the self and the other. At the end of that paragraph, I guess, I've been mulling over the last couple sentences where it says the individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. Similarly, just as each stakes his own life, so each must seek the other's death, for it values the other no more than itself. Essential being is present to it in the form of another. It is outside of itself and must rid itself of its self-externality. The other is an immediate consciousness entangled in a variety of relationships, and it must regard its otherness as a pure being for self or as an absolute negation. And I guess I was a little confused by that specific paragraph. And I know he goes on to talk about how the trial of death does away with the truth, I think is the way, does away with the truth. But the part that I keep thinking about is the staking of one's own life, because he talks about risking your own life. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I understand the sort of philosophical reason to seek the other's death, because you want the immediacy of self-recognition without the externality of recognizing yourself with the other. But why do you need to risk your own life?
Well, because for Hegel, at least, in this structural analysis, this is a reciprocal process. The other is seeking your death as well. So the other self-consciousness is seeking your death as well. So he puts these two self-consciousnesses on the equal footing. So in order for you to be able to kill the other, which we will discuss in more details. I mean, of course, it's a physical death in terms of annihilation, but it is also making permanent, making stable, making unchanging. Death is where life ends, and life is basically the movement of desire. Life is a movement, and in death, you have that stability and fixity. And that's what we are searching in our own identity as well. We are searching a kind of fixity. In a sort of interesting, bizarre way, we are actually searching our own permanence, hence death. I want to be what I am always. I want to be certain of that. I want to be in myself that. So when I seek that recognition from the other is seeking that recognition from me as well. So he says before, they are mutually recognizing them, they recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. So I not only seek the recognition of the other, I also recognize that the other is seeking my recognition of it. So this, you know, when you are encountering with a person, there are multiple levels of recognition. Like, okay, I know, you know, I know I'm seeking you recognize me, but I also know that you are seeking you recognize you, right? But then you also know that I am trying to myself be recognized, and I know that too. So that every level of that consciousness, in a sense, like if I want to be recognized, I also want to be, I also have to risk the fact that I will not be recognized. I will do the recognition. You will be recognized. This is a most basic fundamental power relationship, right? So now, when you actually attain that recognition through this struggle, you become proper self-conscious, not rather than a person, he says. And that's significant because, like, you know, when you're, I mean, I have this issue always with my daughter, right? I say, you are good. And she said, what the hell? I don't care what you say. And because that recognition was freely given, she thinks. No struggle, because there's no possibility in her eyes that I'm going to say, that's terrible, you suck. But I say, no, because that actually diminishes you more. You don't need a cheerleader. You don't need someone who will recognize everything that you do. You need someone who properly recognizes you because you struggle and achieved something, rather than, oh, he's my father, he's going to recognize me anyway. So you experience that in your life too. Like, you know, you go to the school and your teacher likes you and always gives you an A. You're like, okay, fine. She's always going to give me an A. He's always going to give me an A. It doesn't matter. But then you go to another teacher, they give you a C. And then you go, no, I want a B. Now I want an A. And then I achieve that. And when you achieve that A, you go like, yes, this is much more as a result of a struggle, because it's more valuable in my own perception of myself, because I worked for it. I risked something for it. It's not just freely given to me. Fanon uses this in terms of end of slavery, how in French colonies, freedom was given to the slaves. And he juxtaposed that to American end of slavery, in which when you fight for it, the recognition of it is much more self-fulfilling than just be given to it. So you don't want cheerleaders and someone who always says, recognize you. No, you don't want someone who recognizes you whatever you want, whatever you say, because that's actually much more killing for you in terms of your soul than even someone who is constantly negative, because ultimately you can dismiss the person constantly says negative to you. If somebody says positive things to you all the time, you become in a strange and bizarre way dependent on them, because you need that person as a cheerleader. You become dependent on that person, even though you are fake, and you as a person become less because you don't need to do anything. So that's the notion of risking your life, as I understand it, more metaphorically. But in terms of colonial situation, it's a real confrontation of somebody coming to the shore and saying, like, I want your, I mean, first of all, I'm not in India, I recognize that. I mean, I want your land, I want your resources, I want your, I want to satisfy my own desires with respect to your, so that confrontation. So that's why you risk that. Who wants to go? Claudia and Daniel?
I was thinking of that same like the slavery part of like how people became or were made into objects, but then them as like working to become like not objects but subjects, like actual people, because they have been like the conscious of the colonizer in this case would be like, you're my object, so you don't have any like emotion or anything else to like I don't know how to explain that. But the thing is, like, what I was gonna like go at is like the liberation of like death also. Like I was thinking of how can you liberate yourself or escape being subjected or being like given this type of characteristic by others, and like how one has to die, like we were talking about, and then like how actually death became a way to escape that.
Escape what?
Like escape being subjugated to like to an identity.
Okay. Wow.
Like, because
But
something that I've talked about in like my other classes is like how death, like especially like for example like between enslaved women, became a really like liberating aspect, because that was like the only way to escape being subjected into slavery, or to like not be under this power of another person.
I think I understand what you are saying now. And that's very interesting, because precisely because of that, Hegel says, you don't die. You should not die. That's the paradox of confrontation of two self-consciousnesses that ultimately leads master and slave. You're right. If you were to die, that recognition would disappear, because the master ultimately becomes dependent on the recognition of the slave, who, without dying, actually sort of acknowledges the power of the master. Now, ironically for Hegel, the next level of consciousness in terms of your relationship to desire is going to be through the slave. So we'll come to that point later, but you are absolutely right. That would be a kind of freedom, but that's the kind of paradoxical aspect of freedom. If you really want to be free, death is the option, right? And that's not just for the slave, because in those material conditions, yes, for the slave, but it's also for every self-consciousness. Therefore, some people say philosophy is a preparation for death, because that's the only notion of freedom that can be exercised in this world. Now, of course, this is not biological death in terms of, like the one you were describing, but it is more like understanding your desires. and not giving into those desires. So that's why I think philosophy is the only way to resist capitalism. So whenever somebody criticizes capitalism, tell them to study philosophy. There's no
my-
other way.
Sorry.
No.
But then that desire that you said would be like the desire of stability as like for example death being the only stable thing, as like because that's death, or stability as like not being defined by the self-conscious, or like your own self-conscious, or like the conscious of someone else.
Well, okay, this gets complicated once we start talking about like, especially in psychoanalysis and death drive, if you read Freud and the Beyond the Pleasure principle, that life is actually seeking that stability, that death, and that becomes much more complicated. I was thinking more in terms of this paradoxical nature of desire, which in a complicated way determines the movement of capitalism. You need to elicit and create new desires in order to continue to produce and exploit, right? So now, what is your desire? I want to eat and have a house, but then I wanted, I don't know, like a pool, then I wanted another car, I want an iPhone, I want another iPhone, then I want to have this, then I want, like that desire, and then I want to exploit other people, then I want to exploit other people, I want to be acknowledged by other people, then I want to be acknowledged by more people, I want to be popular, then I want to be more popular. So this nature of the desire that ostensibly sustaining life is actually constantly killing itself and moving towards its own destruction. So that relationship to desire becomes very complicated, because on the one hand, you need them to continue living, but it's also killing you. And then you will never satisfy. I mean, the problem with desire is that at the moment of its satisfaction, it produces another desire. And that's how capitalism moves. So yeah, so that's complicated in terms of how to think in relation to Hegel. But let's just stick with master slave. Maybe we'll be able to talk about that more. Do you want to take a break, Esther? You forgot? Daniel, you can start us off, yeah.
Yeah, I think my question is, I'm not sure if it's even really a question, just like a general thought I had reading this section, and it touches on things that I think other people have mentioned. I think Isao mentioned this, what precedes what, and I think Claudia's thing also about slave deaths to escape that particular relation. And I was just thinking about, I guess, the very structure of this, of what Hegel was describing, this master slave dialectic, and the notion of recognition. And I was wondering whether it might actually, I don't know if it's the case that this notion is never actually reached. Because the sense I get from this is yes, it's the claim is it's mutual recognition that self-consciousness is self-consciousness, but at the same time, there's still this structure of firstness and secondness that to me still sort of carries the dominating relationship. And then that sort of leads me to question whether maybe there's recognition, but also whether the question possibility of that recognition actually being mutual, and what that means for this whole.
Well, if you are asking as a starting point, we can perhaps structurally postulate that the starting point, at least the expectation, is mutual recognition. I mean, the problem is, not the problem, but the issue is that you want recognition from someone who is capable of being recognized. you don't want recognition from objects. You don't want recognition from people who act like objects. You don't want like fathers who are like, oh yeah, everything you do is wonderful. That's just like not genuine in the sense of self-recognition. I guess that's why he never talks about this in the context of, you know, familial relationships, and he has other things to say. But this is a structural issue. One thing that you need to, like, this is difficult, I understand, but philosophy requires you to think imaginatively in the sense that if it were to happen, how would it happen? What is the structure? What is the conceptual structure here, rather than whether this empirically or even phenomenologically happens or not? I think phenomenology is really actually the sort of that space in which conceptual construction of experience. If I'm going to have recognition, this is how it's going to be. Now, of course, it doesn't happen mutually. Like they engage in the struggle of recognition. You recognize me, no, I recognize you. This is the most basic conceptual power relations between two self-consciousness. And that power is complicated. It has two dimensions. First, you recognize me more of who I am. I actually become who I am when I'm recognized. Now, one of the issues that we discuss, obviously, in sort of contemporary society of being acknowledged, being heard, having a voice, right? These are all the issues that we identify with identity, like participating in society, being heard, being recognized, being respected. These are all issues about dependency of others to be who you are. And in our society, the Western European white perspective is actually the most dependent on this structure. So what we are going to articulate is like colonization is, the colonizer is dependent on this system. They are invested in the continuity of that system in order to be who they are, what they are, how they think. Now that's one dimension of power, because like you sort of say like, you know, like you are someone like Jeff Bezos, like what else do you need? Just shut up and disappear, right? Like, why do you need anything anymore? Why do you even exist like in public and go to work? Like, would you go to work? Would you do anything? Like, would you like, can you imagine this abstract space in which you are going to try to increase your wealth from 186 billion to 187 billion? And then with that 187, you are like, oh, I feel so great now. It was only 186, now it's 187. This is kind of recognition, which is very difficult to understand because it is not tied to anything specific. It seems to be abstract. So that's the notion of the power, how you define yourself and recognize as such. But there's another dimension of it, and that's, to me, the most important dimension that gets lost in Hegel, is that your relationship to the object. Master fulfills their desire on the work of the slave. Now, that satisfaction of desire for Hegel, being a good philosopher, of course, makes you more dependent on the desire, ultimately makes you more dependent on the conflict, ultimately makes you weak. Now you can say, well, that's not really how you can sell to a colonized neo-colonial world, but it is complicated because we do not understand colonization in terms of the action of certain people who are white and European, etc., but as a structure in which those people happen to take part. It's a part of a fabric. Now, it gets much more complicated in a decolonial, or even in quotation, like I never believe in postcolonial anyway. I don't know why I named the course as such, but in this postcolonial way of, there are multiple identities emanating from this capitalist structure. And that's the one that we are trying to understand. recognition is one thing. We believe that we can recognize, and that's what we try to do. Like, oh, I recognize you. I'm a particularly generous white center, therefore I can acknowledge certain people and recognize them, etc. But what is this object? What is the object that keeps liveliness? Like, is it enough to have that symbolic acknowledgement and recognition without the material dimension of it? And I want to push our, especially in the post, the sort of like, I don't even know what we call that, like contemporary society, contemporary capitalist society, where my material existence is inextricably tied to my symbolic recognition. I want to make that connection in Hegel. So yes, I mean, I don't want to call it an abstraction. I just want to call it conceptual tools to think the most concrete that is in front of us. Because it's very difficult to, without idealizing or sort of generalizing, to think about the concrete unless you have proper conceptual framework. I don't know whether that's an answer to your question, but
a little.
Sounded good to me. Yeah.
A little. I think what I was trying to get at more is sort of like, I think you sort of got at it in like in the conclusion to that I don't know, like maybe part of like this, the problem with the like the emergence of like Europe, like as Europe as like colonizer and all of that is also is like maybe the problem is also in this like same structure of this like recognition thing, that sort of conception, if that like is like is could be where like the problem, quote unquote, emerges.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
In the sense that like this, like the notion of like, not the notion, not the way Hegel used it, but like the possibility that the very structure of the like massive dialectic and whatnot is very colonial in itself, I think is sort of what I'm getting at. Like, yeah.
Well, okay, I agree, but I use your own point against you now. People use this word colonial in a very loose sort of way. We are going to see specifically how colonial it is, like, because it is really important, because Hegel appears to be, and that's my initial insight about this class, that the reason that I start with Hegel gives you a very promising post-colonial world by the negation of colonialism, because it is dialectical, it is that kind of notion. Now, with Derrida, that becomes the problem, because post-colonial can only be the negation of the colonial, not colonial. That in and of itself is incredibly restricting and shaping, that doesn't give any kind of freedom to future. So I talk about this idea of colonizing the future in the first class, namely, if you define the future in terms of the negation of the present, and the only possibility of the future is the negation of present, because you just want to be that. And that's really what we are struggling in terms of identities too. Like, everybody is trying to not be white, European, whatever, cis, Christian, etc. That issue is always defining the other as a negation, as not. And that is really the problem of post-coloniality. And I think this is the problem of like a number of different discourses, not in the same way, but like including feminism in terms of trans movement, etc. Like, not to be something is to be the opposite of the center. And the entire concept of intersectionality can also be discussed about this. So I find that problematic. Derrida finds that problematic in the sense that something to come that is not determined, not even by its negation by the center. Because the center always is like, center somehow rules the future by allowing the future only to be the negation of center. And the negation of the center is always the center. That's the paradox. That's the paradox of dialectic movement. And so we are going to see that. So we will see that in the concrete. Like now it sounds like abstract. Like a lot of decolonial movements are somehow nationalist, in a way that nationalism is a fairly European articulation of identity. That is a both conceptual, but it's a very real problem, because those nations, post-colonial nations, are also constructed by the exclusion of the other within that nation. Africa is a great example for this in multiple formulations. Turkey is like that. Like, like Turkish identity as nationalism is really the sort of negation or subjugation of Kurdish and Armenian, etc. So it's always that paradox that in order not to become X, you become X. That's the conceptual problem. Now, of course, for those of you who are like, for those of us who are not X, that still makes a difference. Like, of course, now I'm the one who is killing, but I'm the one who is killing. I'm the one who is negating, I'm the one who is oppressing, etc. Now, of course, that makes a huge difference in the decolonial structure, but I perpetuate the same structure. And I perpetuate the same issues that I criticize the colonial center does. And that we need to deal with that. That's what we need to think about as a framework. And I think that therefore it is very difficult not to simply reproduce that structure, because it's seeped so much into our everyday thinking, into our scientific worldview, into our relationships, etc. We don't even really understand how much our minds are, in that sense, colonized. And again, this is not a sort of like, at the end of this class, we triumphantly become decolonial and decolonize our minds or something like that. It's just really that even acknowledging the complexity of the multiple ways in which we are implicated in a reproduction of inequality and hierarchy. Now, this is, again, a conceptual problem. That doesn't mean everything you do is the same. You might not as well do anything. There are no relative sort of spaces in which we can act, etc. But we start with the conceptual problem, and don't, have this kind of fake despair or something. I might as well not do anything because I'm not going to be totally decolonized. Hence, I might not even try. Isao and then Mehmet Ali. Yes.
I still have like I'm still like struggling to understand the process of like killing in this concept. And is it that like one needs to be, no, like in order to one to be exist, one needs to be acknowledged, like recognized, so that like one stop recognizing the other means the killing of the other, or but at the same time that leads to that by killing the other, that one loses someone who is depending on to be acknowledged. So is that the process of killing that you're saying?
Yeah, I think you formulated that pretty well. So the paradox is that you want, you risk your life and you try to kill the other, but if the other is dead, the whole recognition is impossible. So
Right.
the other has to give in, has to surrender, and that becomes the slave, thus doing the recognition. And master is the one who is recognized.
Right.
Now, with Claudia, we kind of discussed that once the slave is dead, that this process of recognition uses. So you do want to engage with it. It's sort of like this, like this kind of risking your life. Like whoever gives in, that person loses. Like, you shouldn't play these games, but like two cars like driving towards each other, that if they clash, both of them die, nobody wins. But then at the last moment, one of them says, okay, I don't want to die.
Right.
And then that becomes the recognition. Then the other is like, oh, I'm powerful, I didn't give in, I'm so like, right? So that's the structure. But ironically, then you become dependent on that recognition. Now,
Right.
and for that recognition to be permanent, the other needs to be permanent too. So in a sense, this paradox is that you want the other to be always the same, but that means death.
Right.
So this is the nature of recognition too. Like, once you are recognized by someone, that's not enough.
Right.
And that's the kind of desire aspect of recognition too. Like, like, would you be like, if somebody says like, you are really good, you did awesome, good for you. Then you go like, what do I do now?
Right.
Tell me more. Tell me all the time. Tell me again. And then, hey, you tell me too. You tell me too. So that's kind of the sort of movement. And if you constantly keep telling me, that doesn't mean anything too. So like, this is the kind of paradox. I want the stability, but I don't want it.
Right.
That's the paradox.
So like if the other, like otherness dies, like impermanence, like does that make it also dead? Because like it can no longer be like providing you the recognition.
Exactly. At least in that particular relationship, yes.
Okay. So it's like
you can always find others to
kill.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's why, like, whenever you sort of have these relationships with other people, when you're sort of like, you are a nice person, I'm sure you are going to earn them, etc. You sort of tell them like, oh, you are awesome, you are great. Once in a while, you have to tell them like, oh, that wasn't that awesome. That you suck at that. That wasn't really good or something. That's really necessary for the others' acts of recognition to have any meaning anyway, right? So that's the kind of complexity of human relationships. We want it, but we don't want it. And, you want your father to acknowledge, or I'm father, that's why I'm saying it, to like your work, but after a while it becomes, that's not satisfying anymore.
So like the disregard actually makes you kind of more like lively, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. And then they can change too. That's the other thing. Like you want them to change, and then like if somebody comes to you and it's like, yeah, I really liked you when I was 15 years old, but now that I'm 25, I really, really like you. And you go like, that's even better. Because
right.
Like, when you were 15, like you didn't stay there, etc. But then you moved on. But even after that change, you are still recognizing.
Okay, that makes sense.
And you all know all of this, right? I mean, when I tell these things to you that appear to be pretty clear, right? It's just that you need the language to express it. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Or if anybody thinks that I have no idea what you are talking about, I don't have that kind of relationship with people. Yes, Mehmet Ali, sorry, go ahead.
So you had said that like we don't get recognition from objects or people that act like objects. So that's a perceptual thing, right? It's not like, oh, well, this is like universally definitively an object, and so whatever relationship you have with that thing, it's not going to be recognition. So if you can you have sort of the opposite of like this, that thing's like, you know, would probably like, sorry, like if you're just like a narcissist and someone keeps telling you, oh, you're doing a great job, you're doing a great job, can you have like a recognition relationship with that person, even though it's not sort of the difficult thing? Or like, if you mistakenly think someone's talking to you when they're not, and so they're not really engaging with you, but you still get something out of that interaction, can that happen?
There's actually a couple of different questions there, because let's just unpack that notion of narcissism first. That kind of that's the problem of narcissism. Like, what did you mean by that? Like,
just in the sense that, like, as opposed to the interaction where someone keeps giving you praise and praise and praise, and you go, ah, well, then it doesn't really mean anything. If someone gives you praise and praise and praise, and you're like, yes, I'm into this, and like you don't sort of, you don't go through that process of, oh, this isn't meaningful. If you keep thinking that that's meaningful, is that sort of a recognition interaction?
No, okay, maybe I understand it. I think that let's start with that. So let's start with the sort of double sense or the doppelsinn of narcissism. Like, is narcissism a healthy relationship to yourself?
No, I don't think so.
I mean, is the opposite of narcissism a healthy relationship to yourself? So it's really a matter of degree. It's not like whether you are a narcissist or not. The question is, how much narcissist are you? And it has to be just the right amount of narcissism according to psychologists, because if it is less, then you have issues. If it is more, you have issues. If it is less, you have issues because you have more. If you have issues that you have more, then it has to be less. It's just like, that's the sort of the paradox of self-relation, right? That's the paradox of every relation. Once you have like, oh, I love myself, it's like, oh, you are like problematic. And then you say like, oh, I don't love myself. It's like, what's wrong with you? So then you'll say like, that relationship to myself, I don't even define in terms of narcissism, because it is not a category that in and of itself means categorically you are in or out. This is the problem with categories. They create this kind of, you are either in or you are not. You are not in. You are either a narcissist or you are not. Both of them are wrong. You are both a narcissist and not. You are neither a narcissist nor a not narcissist. This is the relationship, because with respect to some people, I appear to be very narcissistic because I hate them. I don't want to get along with them. And with other people, I am very weak and I want them to love me and I want to get their attention. Therefore, I'm not like that. So narcissism is not a category. It is a way of relating to the other people. Your self-relation to yourself is a relationship to the others. Okay. So if we stop thinking about ourselves, which is, I'm not saying it's easy, etc., but in terms of categories, whether I am X or not, am I this or am I not? Even within that category, even if you accept that you are that category, you don't even have to accept that that category is a stable one. Because when I say I am a man, let's just say I said it, I am a man. In 1978 in Turkey, even though it appears to be the same category, it's not even the same being in 2020 in the United States. So the category itself is not stable, as even as a sign in language, it's not stable. So it would be a completely mistaken understanding of even the nature of category to imagine that it is stable. To be a woman is not the same in different times, in different places, it's different relationships. So now if we insist that there's a universal category, then we are denying that fluidity of the concept completely for sometimes political reasons, for personal reasons, etc. But what we are really doing is killing those who are not the same way within that category if we define that category stable. Therefore, probably there is nothing worse than being rejected from a category that you think that you belong, right? When I go to Turkey, they tell me I'm not Turkish. They say, you're not Turkish. I was like, okay, I mean, I read Hegel, so I'll take you on, but that doesn't really hurt my feelings. But they say it because like, oh, you speak like an American. And then in America, obviously they say you are definitely not an American. I was like, okay, good. So that's the kind of paradox of like, and then I recognize that I understand that my identity is not constructed by me. And that is so liberating. It's like, yes, come on, do it, say it, like, yes. And that's not just like in terms of privilege versus the lack of privilege, it's really sort of conceptually liberating. Because then I don't need to control other people's self-consciousness of my consciousness, of my self-consciousness. That's how you, and you also like, okay, we'll come to that. That's Friday. Yeah, okay. Are you done, Mehmet Ali, or do you want to come back, or?
I would like to dig a little bit more into just like the second case where you're just mistaken. Like if you know, you think someone's talking to you, but they weren't, or if you're talking to a robot that's giving you random words that just happen to like be like exactly like an interaction that you would have with with another person. Can you have recognition there?
No, that's an excellent question. I would say conceptually no, but existentially, I don't even know how to answer that question because that happens all the time. I don't even know whether I'm talking to you right now. I don't even know any one of you is listening to me and understanding anything that I'm saying. I might be engaged in this performance of some desperate kind of attempt to communicate, which you will sort of turn off Zoom and then go your separate way. So existentially, that's really difficult to articulate. But I think that none of this might ever happen. Like you might never, I mean, I think this actually happens a lot of people. Like you never really fully recognize yourself. That's just impossible. Even, I mean, you must be dead, but when you are dead, you cannot do that either. But it is really like living in that liminal space of never really catching up and not even knowing whether you are coming to terms with that idea of yourself. And then you die. Yeah. So no, I would say it is also very difficult to know that whether you are even talking to yourself in a sort of real sense. Like, am I hearing myself? Am I really like confronting myself, which again is a very, very difficult process. Especially after what Claudia said, that if we are kind of constructed in terms of these forces that are really not immediately accessible to us, according to Hegel, we really need to know a whole lot about the world and the history and the human fabric in order to understand ourselves. It's an abstraction to say like, oh, I am this. It's like, that's an abstraction. You are abstracting yourself, literally taking away from all the relationships, and you are pretending to be selbstständig, like independent by yourself. Can I understand myself when I say I'm a Turk? What the hell do you mean you are a Turk? You don't understand anything about what it means to be Turk in terms of Turkish history, etc. You are just sort of talking abstractly about your passport. And then people ask me about Turkey, and I don't know. How should I know? I don't know who I claim to be. And it's good, because obviously you don't want to be an expert on your culture at Erlem. That's an excruciating process. You have to cook too. What do you eat there? So you can cook that. So yeah, that's yeah, complicated for Hegel. Yeah. Masha, you had something, sorry.
I can save my question for the next time.
Oh, you want to leave? Okay.
No, I don't want to leave, but I don't want to keep people waiting.
Oh, that's really nice. See, you know, this is just like self-consciousness confronting each other. I don't want to leave. I just don't want to keep you. Nice one. I like that. So we'll continue on Friday. I'm sorry, I was gonna try to show a film, but we didn't really move very much. So we'll just use Friday between 1 to 4. And thank you for your questions and your participation. This is awesome. It's really like after 3 hours of Hegel, I don't even feel tired. So that's